What if your greatest emotional weakness wasn't a defect, but a silent inheritance that you received from your father? Have you ever wondered why you react the same way, even though you promise yourself that you would do it differently? Why do certain situations arouse guilt, fear, or silence, as if something old has taken over? The answer may not lie in what you live today, but in the emotional inheritance that began back in childhood, especially in the relationship with your father. What many people call emotional weakness is actually a sophisticated survival system. A set of legacy standards that emerged to ensure self-protection, but which were never updated. The problem is that these patterns shape your inner voice, your choices, and even how much you allow yourself to feel all without you realizing it. In this content, you will understand how emotional conditioning takes hold, how it affects the brain, and why awareness is the first real step to emotional healing and breaking cycles. It's not about blaming the past, it's about regaining control of the present. Because what has been learned can indeed be transformed. Have you ever had the feeling of being tired without knowing exactly what? As if you were carrying an emotional backpack that he never chose to put on his back. This invisible weight often comes from the emotional inheritance received in childhood, passed on silently, especially in the relationship with the father. It's not drama, it's emotional conditioning working in automatic mode. This burden often manifests as an emotional weakness that is difficult to explain. A constant self-demand, a diffuse fear of making mistakes, or that feeling of always owing something to the world. In practice, they are inherited patterns that were born as survival and self-protection strategies, but which have never been reviewed with adult awareness. The curious thing is that this weight is rarely perceived as something learned. It becomes identity. I'm like this, I've always been like this. And that's where the danger lies when the inner voice repeats old stories as if they were absolute truths. Before thinking about emotional healing or breaking cycles, it is necessary to see this weight for what it is: something inherited, not chosen. The relationship with the father is rarely noisy at first. It acts deep down, behind the scenes, shaping perceptions, reactions, and expectations without asking permission. Sometimes it was absence, other times excessive rigidity, emotional silence, or unpredictability. Be that as it may, this coexistence in childhood becomes an emotional inheritance, invisible, but decisive. When your father didn't know how to deal with emotions, you learned to swallow yours. When he was too critical, the inner voice began to demand perfection. When you were distant, you associated affection with effort. None of this was conscious. It was pure emotional conditioning, a childish reading of the environment to ensure survival and self-protection. The key point here is not to accuse, nor to romanticize. It is to realize how certain inherited patterns began there, in that attempt to be accepted, seen, or, at least, not rejected. This realization makes room for something powerful: the awareness that much of what you call the way of being was born as a response to the father and not as an immutable essence. What you call emotional weakness is almost never real weakness. Most of the time, it was adaptation. It was children's emotional intelligence trying to ensure survival in an environment where feeling too much, talking too much, or making too many mistakes seemed dangerous. The problem is that the brain learns fast and generalizes. Have you become too sensitive? Perhaps he learned to read the weather to protect himself. Does it avoid conflicts? It may have been the only way to maintain some peace with his father. Do you cancel yourself? This may have been self-protection, not a lack of strength. The mistake is to continue using old strategies in a life that has already changed. When this adaptation becomes identity, the inner voice starts to attack. You're weak, you can't stand it, you're awesome. Here comes consciousness as a turning point. Seeing that these behaviors are inherited patterns, not defects, changes everything. And it is exactly this change of view that prepares the ground for emotional healing without haste, without guilt, but with truth. The inner voice that accompanies you today did not come out of nowhere. She was trained, sentence by sentence, in living with her father. Sometimes in what he said directly, sometimes in what he never said. A rare compliment, a frequent criticism, a silence that is too long, all of this turns into internal dialogue over time. If the father was demanding, the voice demands perfection. If it was unstable, the voice lives on alert. If it was absent, the voice asks all the time if you are good enough. This is emotional conditioning in action, shaping how you treat yourself, correct yourself, and even punish yourself. It is not psychological drama, it is repeated learning in childhood. The turning point begins when you realize that this voice is not you as an echo. A set of inherited patterns that can be consciously updated. A simple exercise when self-criticism arises: ask whose voice is this? This small gesture already weakens the old programming and opens up real space for emotional healing and breaking cycles. A lot of people didn't have a difficult childhood in the classic sense. What they lacked was emotional security, so the child learns quickly. He observes the tone of his father's voice, reads expressions, anticipates conflicts. To grow up like this is to live in survival mode, always attentive, always adjusting. Not by choice, but by self-protection. You learn not to bother, not to feel too much, not to ask. He learns that emotion is risk. This emotional conditioning shapes the body and mind, creating automatic patterns of silence and adaptation. The curious thing is that, on the outside, this is usually praised mature, responsible, strong. Inside, it becomes emotional weakness, not understood. In adult life, the environment has changed, but the system continues to run the same old software. Awareness begins when you realize that this constant vigilance was born in childhood and is not a character defect, it is an inherited pattern that can be revised. And this realization sets the stage for the next point, because the body also holds this history. When childhood takes place in unpredictable environments where the father's mood changes quickly or affection is unstable, the brain learns to live alertly. The nervous system adapts to detect danger before it even appears. This is pure emotional conditioning, aimed at survival, not well-being. In practice, this explains anxiety without a clear cause, difficulty relaxing, and an inner voice that never shuts down. The body has been trained to anticipate problems, not to rest. What now looks like emotional weakness is actually a hyper-functional brain, shaped to protect you when no one else did. The good news is that the brain is plastic. With awareness, new paths can be created. Simple practices such as mindful breathing, emotional writing, or readings like Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Marks help reprogram these inherited patterns. Here, emotional healing begins to cease to be a concept and becomes an experience. In childhood, being silent, avoiding, pleasing, or canceling oneself were not defects, they were self-protection. They were intelligent solutions found by a child to deal with his father, with the environment, and with emotional insecurity. These mechanisms ensured survival, and for this reason they were registered as functional. The problem arises when these strategies continue to rule adult life. Avoiding conflicts becomes a difficulty in positioning yourself. Silencing emotions becomes internal disconnection. Pleasing too much turns into exhaustion. What used to protect now limits. The emotional weakness is not in the strategy itself, but in using it outside the original context. Awareness comes in when you realize that you can choose new answers. A practical step before you shut up: observe the impulse and test small breaks, saying a simple no, expressing a slight discomfort, so you get to safely dismantle legacy patterns. It's not confrontation. It's emotional healing in motion, making room for the next layer. The relationship with your father ends up becoming a silent mold of how you relate to yourself and the world. This is your emotional blueprint, a set of internal rules about love, worth, wrongdoing, and worthiness. It is born in childhood, but remains active if it is not questioned. If affection came with demand, you learn that you need to perform to deserve it. If he came with distance, he learns to fend for himself. These inherited patterns shape choices, relationships, and even the inner voice that defines what you find acceptable to feel or desire. All of this seems normal because it has always been that way. The turning point is to realize that this blueprint is not destined. With awareness, you can redesign these internal rules. A simple exercise is to observe: how do I deal with my mistakes, or how do I talk to myself when I fail? This observation reveals the trait of the Father operating from the inside and sets the stage for a more humane and less rigid view of this figure. There comes a time when maturing emotionally is no longer blaming the Father, nor defending him. It is to see him as human, limited, wounded, conditioned by his own emotional heritage. This does not erase pain, nor does it justify absences, but it gives you back something essential: awareness. When the Father ceases to be the absolute villain or the untouchable hero, something inside relaxes. The inner voice loses rigidity. You begin to realize that many inherited patterns were not born of evil, but of emotional ignorance and psychic survival. And understanding this is not weakness, it is real emotional maturity. This humanization is a powerful step in emotional healing, because it gets you out of the prison of repetition. A practical exercise: write a letter that will not be sent, saying what was missing, what hurt, and what you understand today. This simple gesture helps to break the cycle without denying one's own history. And it sets the stage for something even more liberating. The moment you realize that your behaviors are not personal defects, but learned responses, something changes inside. Consciousness works like a light on in an old room. Nothing suddenly disappears, but everything becomes clearer. Emotional weakness loses the label of failure and gains context. When you understand that these patterns were born in childhood, in response to the parent and the environment, the guilt begins to fall. It was not a lack of strength. It was survival. It was self-protection. This understanding weakens emotional conditioning and gives you back the ability to choose something that once seemed impossible. In practice, consciousness is observing without attacking oneself. To perceive the impulse, the automatic reaction, the critical inner voice, and not obey immediately. A good support here is the reading of Mindfulness by Jon Kabat-Zinn, or Simple Practices of Attention to the Body. This is the true beginning of emotional healing and the natural gateway to breaking the invisible rules that still rule your life. There are rules that no one has written but that have governed your emotional life for years. Do not feel, do not ask, do not fail, do not be too much. These internal laws emerged in childhood as a form of self-protection, usually linked to the relationship with the Father and the fear of losing bond or approval. The problem is that these rules remain active even when they no longer make sense. They feed emotional weakness, hinder decisions, and silence legitimate desires. This is emotional conditioning operating on automatic, repeating inherited patterns without asking permission from your adult consciousness. Breaking these rules does not require radical rebellion, but small conscious acts. Ask for help in something simple. Say what you feel without justifying yourself too much. Allowing yourself to make mistakes in public. Each such gesture weakens the old script and strengthens a new inner voice, more human and less punitive. This is how the breaking of cycles begins to take real shape, setting the stage for redefining what real strength is. For a long time, emotional strength was confused with swallowing everything quietly. Not to feel, not to ask, not to show. This concept is usually born in childhood, especially in the way the Father dealt or did not deal with emotions. The result is apparent maturity, underpinned by self-protection, not conscious choice. True strength begins when you realize that feeling is not about losing control, it is about gaining awareness. Emotional maturity is not the absence of emotion, it is the ability to listen to it without being overwhelmed by it. Here, the inner voice ceases to be a judge and becomes an ally. The old emotional weakness reveals itself as unintegrated sensitivity. In practice, redefining strength is choosing differently from inherited patterns. It is resting without guilt, setting limits without aggressiveness, saying what you feel without canceling yourself. Small choices build a new identity based on autonomy, emotional healing, and breaking cycles. And when that starts to happen, something powerful comes up. You stop surviving emotionally and actually start living. After everything we have seen, there is a question that is impossible to ignore: how many choices in your life are still being made by the child who had to survive emotionally? How many times does your inner voice still repeat old rules, learned in childhood, to deal with a world that has already changed? Realizing this is not weakness, it is consciousness in its purest state. Emotional healing does not begin by changing the past, but by taking responsibility for the present. Questioning inherited patterns, reviewing the way you protect yourself, feel and silence yourself. What was once self-protection can now become a choice. And every conscious choice is a real step in breaking cycles, including those that came from the father, the family, and the story you didn't choose to live. So I leave you with some reflections. What do you still call emotional weakness, but maybe it's just unheard pain? What invisible emotional rule can you start breaking today, even in something small? What new definition of strength do you want to build from now on? If this content made sense to you, subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and continue this journey of awareness and emotional transformation with me. Because understanding your story changes everything, but acting on that understanding changes your life.